When the Supermarine Seafire first appeared in Japanese reports, it seemed like an unlikely enemy. To them, it was a land-based Spitfire awkwardly forced onto carriers, a compromise that could never truly rival the nimble Zero. Yet, when encounters began, the reality was different. The Seafire carried the reputation of the legendary Spitfire into the Pacific, and its arrival forced Japanese pilots and commanders to reevaluate their assumptions about air superiority. First encounters, the Spitfire's naval twin arrives. When Japanese intelligence first learned that Britain had adapted the Spitfire for carrier use, skepticism was immediate. Reports described it as the Seafire, essentially a Spitfire with naval modifications, but Japanese analysts doubted its practicality. Carrier aviation demanded ruggedness, long range, and forgiving flight handling. By contrast, the Spitfire was famous for its agility and speed, but also for its short legs and delicate frame. To the Japanese, the very idea of landing such an aircraft on a pitching carrier deck sounded absurd. The first sightings came in the Mediterranean, when Axis observers noted Seafires escorting Allied fleets. News filtered back to Tokyo through German channels, and Japanese staff officers treated it as little more than a curiosity. But in the Pacific theater, things became personal. When British carriers joined American task forces in the later stages of the war, Japanese airmen finally faced the Seafire in combat. At first, some dismissed it as simply another Allied fighter, smaller in number compared to the ever-present Hellcat or Corsair. Yet pilots quickly noticed its resemblance to the Spitfire they had heard so much about. The sleek elliptical wings, the sharp nose profile, and the way it turned sharply in combat carried an aura of danger. For Japanese aviators, many of whom had already been stretched thin by losses against American fighters, the thought of another formidable opponent was not welcome. The Seafire's reputation preceded it, and despite doubts about its naval suitability, Japanese forces knew that in the air it had the potential to be every bit as dangerous as its land-based predecessor. A fighter on a carrier, Japan's skepticism. Despite its sleek design, the Seafire's presence on carriers fueled Japanese skepticism more than fear. The Zero had been designed from the ground up as a naval aircraft, light, agile, and built for long missions over the ocean. The Seafire, in Japanese eyes, was a land fighter awkwardly bolted onto a carrier. Intelligence briefings highlighted its fragile undercarriage, narrow landing gear, and limited endurance, traits considered fatal flaws in naval combat. Japanese naval officers regarded it as a symbol of desperation rather than strength. Britain, they believed, lacked the resources to develop a truly specialized carrier fighter like the Americans. The Seafire seemed like a shortcut, an attempt to adapt an iconic design rather than build one suited to the sea. Such thinking led many commanders to underestimate it, assuming it would struggle with hard deck landings, salt water corrosion, and the stresses of carrier operations. Pilots, however, took a more cautious view. Reports from early encounters suggested that once airborne, the Seafire flew much like the Spitfire, a machine the Japanese deeply respected. This duality created a strange impression. On the ground and in theory, the Seafire seemed unsuited for naval war, but in the sky it was a dangerous adversary. Japanese veterans noted that the Seafire could hold its own in turning battles, something few American carrier fighters attempted against the Zero. Its armament, 20mm Hispano cannons, was devastating when they connected, and its climb rate rivaled the best interceptors Japan fielded late in the war. Still, doubts persisted. For every pilot who respected it, there were commanders who saw it as fragile and temporary, a weapon unlikely to shape the wider course of the naval air war. Technical shock: speed, firepower, and climb. The more Japanese pilots engaged with the Seafire, the more they realized it was no mere curiosity. Reports emphasized three qualities that alarmed airmen: speed, firepower, and climb. In each category, the Seafire carried the DNA of the Spitfire, refined for naval combat. Against the Zero, which relied on agility and lightness, these strengths were significant. Speed was the most obvious. Seafires could push past 370 miles per hour, a dangerous margin when Japanese interceptors were increasingly outclassed. In combat, this meant the Seafire could dictate when to engage or disengage. Japanese pilots, accustomed to chasing slower Wildcats or early Hellcats, found themselves struggling to close the gap. The Seafire's acceleration in dives also made it a formidable opponent, as it could dive away from attacks and recover quickly. Its firepower was equally intimidating. The Hispano cannons fired with brutal impact, tearing through lightweight Japanese aircraft that had little armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst could shred a Zero, and survivors often recalled the fearsome ripping sound of cannon shells hitting wings or fuselages. Unlike machine-gun-armed American planes of early war years, the Seafire's armament gave it a psychological edge. Perhaps most alarming was its climb rate. Japanese pilots noted that the Seafire could climb steeply, intercepting bombers or evading attacks with startling efficiency. This directly countered one of Japan's favored tactics, attacking from above with energy advantage. When Seafires appeared, they could meet interceptors head-on in the vertical fight, nullifying that edge. Taken together, these traits marked the Seafire as more than an adapted Spitfire. To Japanese aviators, it was a clear sign that even Britain, stretched thin by years of war, could field fighters as advanced as anything in the Pacific. For pilots already demoralized by Hellcats and Corsairs, the Seafire was yet another reminder. The Allies' technological tide was unstoppable. Weaknesses exposed: short range and fragile gear. For all its strengths, Japanese analysts quickly spotted the Seafire's vulnerabilities, and they were not insignificant. The first flaw was range. Naval battles in the Pacific often stretched across hundreds of miles, and endurance was the lifeblood of a carrier fighter. The Zero had been designed with this in mind, boasting extraordinary fuel efficiency that allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. The Seafire, by contrast, inherited the Spitfire's short legs. With only around 470 miles of range in combat conditions, it could not match the vast distances required in Pacific operations. Japanese planners considered this a crippling limitation, restricting the Seafire to defensive roles near carrier groups rather than deep offensive strikes. Equally concerning to Allied pilots, and noticed by Japanese observers, was the fragility of the aircraft itself. The Spitfire had always been a thoroughbred racer, designed for performance rather than punishment. On land bases, this was manageable, but on carriers, it became a liability. Japanese intelligence reported frequent accidents during carrier landings, with the narrow undercarriage prone to collapse under rough handling. Saltwater exposure and deck landings strained its airframe, leading Japanese analysts to conclude the aircraft was ill-suited for sustained naval warfare. Pilots who faced the Seafire noticed other weaknesses. Its fuel tanks were not as well protected as those in American designs, making it vulnerable to incendiary hits. Its takeoff performance was also marginal on short carrier decks, limiting how heavily armed it could be without risk. Thus, while Japanese pilots respected the Seafire's aerial performance, commanders frequently dismissed it as a delicate bird, unsuited for the Pacific environment. The Zero, for all its later disadvantages, was still regarded as a true naval aircraft. The Seafire, though deadly in combat, remained in Japanese eyes a fighter that belonged on land. Early engagements testing Japan's fighters against the Seafire. When Japanese pilots finally clashed with Seafires in the Pacific, their initial skepticism turned into a more nuanced assessment. Early encounters occurred during operations involving the British Pacific Fleet, particularly around Sumatra and later in Okinawa. For many Japanese aviators, it was their first time facing a British carrier fighter, and the Seafire surprised them. In dogfights, its resemblance to the Spitfire was unmistakable. Pilots reported that the Seafire could turn sharply, holding its line against the Zero in a contest that few American fighters dared to enter. Though the Zero still enjoyed superior low-speed maneuverability, the margin was slimmer than expected. Japanese veterans admitted that attempting extended turning engagements against Seafires was risky, as the British machine retained energy better and could break away when needed. The real shock came in firepower. When cannon shells from Seafires struck Japanese aircraft, the effect was devastating. Pilots who survived described wings shorn off, fuel tanks exploding, and entire aircraft disintegrating after a few hits. This contrasted sharply with the drawn-out duels they often had with American machine-gun-armed fighters. The Seafire's guns ended battles quickly, a reality that unnerved Japanese squadrons already suffering from inexperience and attrition. Still, Japanese observers noticed that Seafires were rarely present in large numbers. Most air battles centered around the Hellcat and Corsair, with Seafires filling secondary roles. This limited exposure somewhat softened their perception. The Seafire was respected, but not feared on the same scale as the mass-deployed American fighters. By the later months of 1945, when Japan's defense was collapsing, Seafires contributed to the attrition that eroded what little aerial strength remained. Japanese pilots acknowledged its capability, but concluded it was not a game-changer. It was, however, another reminder that the Allies possessed an endless arsenal of advanced machines. Psychological impact: a Spitfire on the seas. Beyond performance figures and tactical outcomes, the Seafire carried a powerful psychological weight. To Japanese forces, the Spitfire was already a legend. Though they had not faced it directly in Europe, they knew of its reputation. The aircraft that had saved Britain during the Battle of Britain, a fighter celebrated across the world as a symbol of resilience. Seeing that same design now appearing from the decks of carriers was deeply unsettling. For naval officers, the Seafire symbolized Allied adaptability. Carrier warfare had long been considered Japan's domain. From Pearl Harbor to the early Pacific campaigns, the Zero had dominated the seas, its range and maneuverability unmatched. But here was proof that Britain, despite years of bombing and resource strain, could still project power with modern carrier fighters. It was a stark reminder that Japan's technological and industrial advantages of 1941 had evaporated. Pilots felt the psychological weight differently. To engage a Seafire was to fight a machine already mythologized. Its sleek shape, instantly recognizable, carried an aura of invincibility. Even if it shared weaknesses, the psychological impact of facing a Spitfire derivative was immense. Some Japanese airmen described a sense of dread, as though the legendary European warplane had followed them into the Pacific specifically to seal their fate. For civilians, the symbolism was subtler. Reports of Seafires operating alongside American fighters reinforced the idea that Japan was not just fighting one industrial giant, but the combined might of empires. The Seafire was more than a weapon, it was a statement. The Allies could adapt, innovate, and bring their finest machines to bear on any front. In this sense, the Seafire's psychological impact far outweighed its numbers. It embodied the Allies' relentless pressure, leaving Japanese forces with a haunting realization that the world's most iconic fighter now ruled their seas as well. Legacy: respect mixed with dismissal. In the end, Japanese reflections on the Seafire were layered with contradiction. On one hand, it was respected as a capable fighter, carrying the pedigree of the Spitfire into the Pacific. Its speed, climb, and firepower impressed even hardened veterans, who admitted it could match or even outfight their own interceptors in certain conditions. Pilots who survived encounters spoke with wary admiration of its cannon bursts, and its ability to stay competitive in turning battles, a feat many American carrier fighters avoided. Yet for all this, Japanese commanders often dismissed the Seafire as strategically insignificant. It was encountered in far fewer numbers than the ubiquitous Hellcats and Corsairs, and its operational weaknesses limited its impact. Reports of accidents on carrier decks, fragile landing gear, and short range confirmed early suspicions that it was an aircraft fighting outside its natural environment. In contrast, the Zero, even in decline, was still viewed as a true naval creation, built to thrive where the Seafire struggled. This dual perception created a unique legacy. The Seafire was not remembered as a terror like the B-29, nor as a decisive force like the Hellcat. Instead, it occupied a curious middle ground, admired in the air but underestimated as a weapon of war. To Japanese strategists, it symbolized Britain's determination more than its dominance. It was proof that even a nation battered by years of bombing could still adapt one of its greatest designs to meet new challenges. For Japanese pilots, however, the memory was sharper. The Seafire stood as a reminder that the Allies' pool of capable fighters seemed endless. If Hellcats and Corsairs weren't enough, there was always another design waiting in the wings. In that sense, the Seafire became part of the larger truth Japan faced in 1945. They were hopelessly outproduced, outmatched, and outflown. The story of the Supermarine Seafire is one of paradox. To Japan, it was both a fighter to be respected in the air and dismissed on the seas. It carried the aura of the legendary Spitfire, yet struggled with the harsh demands of carrier warfare. Japanese commanders saw fragility where pilots saw danger, a contradiction that mirrored the larger truth of the war itself. By 1945, the Seafire had proven that Britain could still project modern air power despite years of attrition, adding yet another burden to Japan's crumbling defenses. Its legacy was not one of overwhelming destruction, but of symbolic weight, the image of a Spitfire on the ocean, reminding Japan that the Allies' reach was global and unstoppable. That's it for today. Keep watching for more exciting content.